All right, the US Department of Housing and Urban Development is prioritizing housing paired with wraparound services now. Um, Basically telling states, including Washington, if you want to continue to receive federal funding to address the homelessness crisis, you're going to have to prove some outcomes. We're not just going to give you money and you put people who are drug addicted and mentally ill into housing with no expectation of recovery, no expectation that anyone's actually getting well. And my colleague Tim Clauser put up an article today on our Center Square Washington page, which I would highly encourage you to check out. After learning that Washington state officials knew this was coming, it's not been a secret that the Trump administration was moving against the housing first model toward a treatment first model. But Washington state officials told Tim Clauser, my colleague, we've been moving away from this and we are prepared to pivot.
So essentially, last year, HUD tried to change the rules attached to its continuum of care program funding, which goes towards homelessness services, permanent shelters, transitional housing, case management, different types of treatment services. And the changes in these grant guidelines sought to end the housing first approach, which has been embraced by the federal government for the last 13 years. And it just essentially prioritizes putting people in taxpayer subsidized housing without any preconditions for sobriety or participation in different support services. When HUD tried to do this last year, and the courts blocked it, the state knew that they were going to come back and try to do it again. So the state's been trying to prepare for that in advance. And records that I obtained via public records request show that the state commerce department was actually updating its own request for proposal documents to remove any grant criteria that mentioned housing first. They were rewording equity narrative questions to kind of reflect fair housing laws. They were also adding new content for those transitional housing services and different types of supportive services. The state was preparing for this shifted federal priorities, despite Commerce itself providing a statement to me saying, this new funding availability from the federal government is going to create massive gaps in the state's permanent housing supply that state and local funding just isn't going to be able to supplant. And okay, you could make the argument that it's going to leave deep cuts in the state system, but at the same time, the funding that's at stake through HUD's Continuum of Care program, it's about $80 to $81 million annually for the state. But Commerce has annual data from last year that shows that they spent almost $1 billion on homelessness in 2025. 80 million from HUD's Continuum of Care program is just a small piece of that $1 billion pie that Commerce has spent. So yeah, it'll leave deep cuts, but state lawmakers already set aside $15 million earlier this year in anticipation of HUD's new funding guidelines. There's no saying that state Democrats can't return and readjust their funding priorities. I mean, if the state's at risk of losing $60 to $80 million in federal permanent housing money, they could just talk about transitioning some of the almost $1 billion that they're spending on homelessness to fund some of those permanent housing gaps. They might say, look, housing first is on the way out. Oh no, but their documents say a different story. And it might be somewhat foolish of them to continue holding on to the housing first narrative, not because they don't believe in it, but because if they do that and refuse to change their policies, at least in terms of what they do with federal funding, it could result in them losing that funding altogether. Now, there's $60 to $80 million in federal continuum of care funding that is technically at risk for the state, but at risk just means it probably won't all go towards the same projects that they've renewed funding for year after year after year. Instead, the state is going to have to go after funding more transitional housing programs and other types of services that are tied to some type of participation in case management or other support services. The state could change its approach, but it's in their hands now. The changes that we'll have to follow over the coming months is where the federal government puts this money, because this funding application or this funding availability that came out in June from HUD is just the first step. Now all the different continuum of cares have to go out and apply for that funding, and then Congress has to award it. So this is just the first step of many that are ahead.
So, for years, much of the money that HUD has spent on the federal level on mitigating homelessness has gone towards renewing these same permanent housing projects as taxpayer funding has increased and the homelessness and drug addiction crisis has only worsened on our streets. Depending on where you're watching this from and where you live, you see it in your own communities. It's undeniable. And it's not working, obviously. That's why the King County Regional Homeless Authority is under increasing pressure from the city of Seattle and the King County Council to prove their outcomes. Of course, they have either evidence of fraud or misuse of funds that is currently under investigation. And so now we've got this pressure coming from the federal administration as well, a huge about face from the direction we've taken on this problem for decades now. It's going to be, a dramatic change, and hopefully outcomes will be improved for those people that are really struggling.